Hey guys, welcome back. Thanks for joining me today as I talk about my next reading project. If you watched my video from last month, you'll know that I set several goals for 2025. And last month I decided to finish one of the series that I had started. I'd read the first book. I hadn't read the remaining three. I went ahead and did that. It's the Ember and the Ashes series. And it ended up just not being that positive of a reading experience for me. So I figured, why not give myself a little bit of a break from some of the series and work on some of my other goals, one of which is to get through some of these big chunky books that I have. So I decided, let's give one of those a shot. And the book that I chose was Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. This is a big old chunk monster. It is almost 800 pages, I believe, and it felt like it. Some of the previous books, the long books that I talked about, specifically like Gone with the Wind, I know I mentioned that for such a long book it went really fast. This did not. I am not going to lie, 2025 has not been the best start of the year for me. With the first series and then this one as well. I ended up giving this, I think, 3 stars. I came very, very, very close to DNFing it many times. The first 25% of the book, I really did not want to continue, and it was just sheer stubbornness alone that made me push on. But before we get into some of the good things, the bad things about the book, let's talk about, kind of just set the premise. Very brief. So this takes place in our world. Technically it's our world, it's just a world where magic exists. The year is, I think it's 1806, it's early 1800s, it's in England, and it is set during the Napoleonic Wars. So we are introduced first and foremost to one of our main characters, Mr. Norrell. Mr. Norrell lives in some smaller town, village, I can't remember what it's called. Magic is just kind of a fact of life in this world. There are technical magicians and theoretical magicians, and then there are practical magicians. So theoretical magicians are more high-standing people, kind of gentlemen specifically, who gather at one of their various estates and they smoke and they drink and they read really old books and they talk about magic, but they never actually perform any. And then there are the practical magicians, which are not thought of very highly, and they're specifically the poor people in some of the larger cities who say that they're able to read fortunes, or they're able to divine the future, or read cards, something like that. But we get the impression that most of them are charlatans. Now, Mr. Norrell, who we're introduced to early on, is invited by one of these societies, these gentlemen societies that kind of feel self-important, but you get the impression that they can't actually perform any magic, and that's one of the reasons why they're like, oh, it's not fashionable anymore to actually perform magic. That's common, that's kind of lowbrow. They hear about a man in the area, Mr. Norrell, who has this vast library, these really old magical texts that no one else has ever read, and a lot of them were seemingly destroyed, but he's kind of hoarded them through the years. So 2 of the gentlemen in the society send him a letter and invite him to join the society, and they kind of nudge him and say, we'd very much like to visit you in your library. And Mr. Norrell sends this kind of gruff reply, and he's like, well, if I must, I must. He's trying to be polite by like the thinnest veneer of polite society. He just kind of doesn't really want to be bothered by these people. Long story short, they make a deal where if Mr. Norrell can actually perform some magical feat, then the rest of these magicians have to give up their kind of magic leanings. They can't meet anymore, they can't study magic, and they just have to disband. And to everyone's surprise, because no one performs magic anymore, Mr. Norrell actually does. He brings some statues to life, and they're talking and they're moving, and it freaks everyone out. And he is now the only magician in his town. Now, news of this spreads, and Mr. Norrell decides the country is at war. I want to do my duty by my country. I want to serve. I'm going to move to London and try to meet some of these generals and some of these politicians and help them in any way that I can. Now, Mr. Norrell claims that he wants nothing more than to bring magic back into England, but his actions don't typically match that. He hoards all knowledge, all his books very jealously, and it seems like he's deeply insecure of someone coming along, someone with actual talent and outdoing him and making him obsolete. Now, when Mr. Norrell arrives in London, he does go about making connections to important people in the government, but he ends up being more of a novelty act than anything else, where he goes to dinner parties and he kind of charms people and, you know, talks about magic and maybe does little feats of magic, but he's not really doing much in favor of England in this war. He's not really making any concrete change. This leads up to probably about the first 30% of the book, and I think that is why I struggled so much with the beginning, is because we're just given Mr. Norrell and he is such a bland, dry character that is really difficult to be interested in anything that he's doing, because he's really not doing much other than he'll do a little bit of magic here and there, but he's just kind of like, oh, I'm gonna go to a dinner party now and I really don't want to be here and I don't want to talk to anyone, but I'm gonna read a book and I'm gonna try and keep all these books to myself. And the bit that we're getting about the world and the magic in the world is actually interesting, because the author is really inventive in some of the examples that she gives, and how if you're living in a world where magic just exists, some things become normal and then some things don't, and how would society function with that added magic system. And a lot of that is really interesting, but in other ways, the magic is so kind of grounded into the world that it takes all of the excitement out of it. It just kind of drains the fantastic elements out of the fantasy, and it reads very much like a classic rather than a fantasy. About a quarter of the way through the book is when the next main character, Jonathan Strange, finally makes an appearance, and he and Mr. Norrell are opposites in pretty much every way. Jonathan Strange is, we get the feeling, I don't know if we're ever given their actual ages, but he's much younger, he's much more energetic, he's much more down to earth. He likes people, and people like him in a way that Mr. Norrell doesn't really have that kind of social connection with people. Now, Jonathan Strange's approach to magic is much more intuitive than Mr. Norrell's is. So Mr. Norrell, he does a lot of reading, and it's very much about kind of the calculations and the history of magic, whereas Jonathan Strange is just kind of like, I don't really know what I'm doing. I'm just gonna kind of attempt this and see what happens. And he is very successful in a lot of his attempts. He comes to London with his new wife, and he and Mr. Norrell meet and kind of clash. Not kind of, they definitely clash, but there's also this strange bond because they are the only two magicians in England at this time, the only two practical magicians, so the people who are actually performing legitimate magic, supposedly. And there's this kind of understanding between the two of them. It's like if you're in a foreign country and there's only one other person who speaks your language. Even if you don't like that person, that's going to create some sort of a relationship, and that's kind of how they progress initially. Now, Mr. Norrell takes Jonathan Strange as his pupil and agrees to teach him magic, but he doesn't want to teach him too much magic, and he'll give him some books, but he doesn't really want to give him the important books that are actually useful. So in this way, Mr. Norrell is still very much threatened by this other magician. There's no real central plot to the book, which I think is another reason I tended to struggle with it, is I like to have some driving forces. And with this book, it's much more about the journey than it is the destination. It's a very meandering book. and there are a lot of side characters and side quests, and some of these side characters you'll hear from for a few pages and then you'll never hear from them again. Some of the side characters are pretty amusing. There's this man, what's he called, the man with the feathered hair or something like that, who I think is like a fae prince or fae someone, and he falls in love with a servant and is set to make him the king of England. We have a few female characters and they're pretty much all under curses, which isn't great, but a lot of them meet pretty unsavory ends. But when you are dealing with a book of this length, I think you need to I personally need either to really be invested in the characters or the plot. And in this case, I didn't have either. There was no plot really, and the characters, even though they could be fun or funny or amusing sometimes, I wasn't invested in them. I didn't really care about them. There wasn't this like big emotional push with them. It reminded me a little bit in some cases of Diana Wynne Jones' Howl's Moving Castle book, where there's just enough nonsense in the book to be really charming. It's kind of like where you're in a world where the consequences don't really matter initially. But Howl's Moving Castle was also a very short book, so that was completely fine. And I was more invested in those characters than 800 pages of these ones, just because they all had very shallow relationships with each other, even like a married couple. Jonathan Strange and his wife, I don't remember what her name was, but it was just this very shallow relationship. Like, we never really got to the meat of it, which I didn't like. We're given a wide variety of characters, but a lot of them felt like the same man, just slightly different versions of the same man. I can objectively look at this book and say Susanna Clarke is a really talented author. Like, the prose was good, the descriptions were great, there was a lot of creativity, the world was very fleshed out. It felt like she did a ton of research to write this book. But apart from that, there also just wasn't enough that I enjoyed about the world or the characters or the story. And I think that was my problem, is like there was so much to choose from, but none of the choices I particularly liked, if that makes any sense. Now, I know a lot of people love this book. Like, I've mentioned this before, but sometimes once I finish a book, I try not to do it before I read it, but after I've finished and I feel secure in how I feel about it, I'll go to Goodreads, because I'm like, I wonder if anyone else felt this way. And people were very hit or miss, but the people who love this book, they really love it. I was happy to see that a lot of people said they did not enjoy the first read of it, but once they reread it, it became like a favorite. I don't think that's gonna work for me, because I don't plan on rereading it. But I'm glad that this is such a beloved book for so many other people, that they got things out of it that I didn't necessarily. But for me, it was a 3-star. Again, that's not a bad rating, but I was hoping for like a 4 or a 5. I mean, I hardly ever give 5s out, so a 4 would be fantastic. But it is only February. It is early February. I still have plenty of time. I think I'm going to maybe work next on like a specific author. If you watch the video of like my 2025 goals, I have like series, books, authors, genres. I've got a lot of different goals. So maybe next I'll hit a specific author and give that a shot. Fingers crossed. But thank you guys for letting me vent about this book. Let me know if you guys have read it, if you have similar opinions or different opinions. I love talking about people who feel the complete opposite that I do about a book. But it is what it is. So I will see you guys in my next video. I hope you have a great weekend. Bye.